on Northshire's YouTube channel. But don't worry, only the people who are unmuted and speaking and highlighted in this nice little yellow box will be the ones showing up on the internet there. And then likewise, if you have any questions for our guests tonight, please type them at any point during the chat. Rachel and I will save them up for you, and we'll then take turns posing them when we get to the Q&A at the end of the event. And the last thing is just a note of thanks. It's been a hard year for independent bookstores and local independent stores of all kinds, and we couldn't have gotten through it without your help. So we really appreciate it. All right, well, let me hand things over to Rachel.
Hi there, everybody. Tonight, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome Emma Smith to Northshire Live. She is a professor of Shakespeare Studies at Oxford University and has published widely on Shakespeare and other early dramatists. She's joining us tonight from Oxford to talk about her fascinating book, This is Shakespeare, which was recently released in paperback. Tonight, she'll be interviewed by a longtime friend of the Northshire, Marcus Dean Fuller, the executive and artistic director of Saratoga Shakespeare Company. He's an actor, writer, director, and producer with over 25 years experience working in film, television, and stage. We're delighted to have partnered with our great friends at Saratoga Shakespeare to present this evening's event and encourage you to visit saratogashakespeare.org to learn more about their terrific work in our community and sign up for their email list. Please join me in welcoming Emma Smith and Marcus Dean Fuller to Northshire Live.
Hi, Emma. Can everybody hear me okay? Everybody's good? I see a lot of nods. That's good. Okay. So Emma and I were chatting a little bit before all of you joined us, and we were talking a little bit about the world in general and about her amazing book. And I was saying that as an artist, you know, I love reading these books, especially, you know, anything on Shakespeare and as they unpack the work and the histrionics, etc. And I said with this book, This is Shakespeare, I was blown away for a lot of reasons, but mostly it wasn't what was being said, it was the fact that it was being said, and that it was being said in such an accessible way that as an artist, I didn't just find new information, I found a tool, a working tool. And so as we kind of get into this tonight, I hope that you will also be adding this to your life toolbox. It is quite amazing and remarkable. So before we get into this, I want to do a little theatrics here. I want to build a world, okay? I want you to imagine a world full of civil unrest with class division and a world in which plague is ravaging the countryside. And I'm not talking about our current time. I'm talking about the Elizabethan times in the 16th and 17th century, and enter William Shakespeare. So I'd like to start, if I may, with a little quote from the introduction of your book. The introduction, you say, "The Shakespeare in this book is more questioning and ambiguous, more specific to the historical circumstances of his own time, more unexpectedly relevant to ours." This begins something that you start to build upon, and you give it a term, gappiness. Can you explain for us what gappiness is and how you came to it?
Hi, Marcus. Yeah, thanks. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's a real sort of bittersweet advantage of this scenario, isn't it? That I would never have the chance to talk to you here from Oxford if we weren't in this terrible state. So make of that what you will. Yeah, Marcus has been really nice about my book. So it's a book about Shakespeare, which tries not to be as bossy and as know-all as some books about Shakespeare. And it tries, I think, to sort of suggest to its readers that they are already pretty well skilled in how to get to grips with Shakespeare. It's not something for specialists. It's not something that's too difficult. And that's one of the reasons I think Shakespeare often looks very difficult to us, is that we are taught quite early on to think that there is a right answer, that Shakespeare sort of means something and we aren't maybe quite understanding it, we're not quite getting it. We need help to understand what his meaning is, and we need a kind of translator or something. And once we've got that translator, we've got the answer. And I suppose in my book, I'm trying to say something different, which is that a lot of the ways in which Shakespeare is difficult is not it's not us, it's him, and he's difficult because he's actually sort of trying to keep 2 or 3 possibilities open at the same time. So when things are difficult to follow or to understand, it's usually because they're a bit knotted up, or maybe a bit insincere or inauthentic. Complicated speeches in Shakespeare are usually characters who are not being truthful to themselves or to us. And the speeches are complicated because of that kind of that sort of hide and seek there is with them. So instead of the kind of right answer Shakespeare, I tried to think about a Shakespeare who needs us to engage with his works, and leaves a lot of space for us to do that. And that space I call a kind of gappy quality. And the gappiness in Shakespeare is all the questions, the unresolved things, the ambiguities, the ways in which it's not clear what happens or what a character should look like, or why the things that happen. And those gaps are, I think, the spaces for us. And they've always been spaces for us. That's why I think Shakespeare has lasted and has continued to be so important, that instead of being a kind of complete, sealed up sort of cultural icon, instead his works have been very, very permeable, very porous, very spacious, and generations of thinkers and theatre makers and readers like us have made their own meanings out of them. That's the greatest gift they can give us. So gappiness is the opposite of the right answer, and instead it's saying Shakespeare's full of holes, and the good thing about the holes is there's space for us to get inside, get alongside.
Oh, I love that. So it's interesting. When I got to the introduction, I was very excited, and this idea of gappiness is floating around my head. I open up to the first chapter. You touch on 20 different plays in the course of the book, and the first chapter you chose to touch on, it was Taming of the Shrew, which was kind of surprising for me at first, and until I started getting into it. Can you explain why you chose Taming of the Shrew?
Well, I chose Taming of the Shrew because it's an early play by Shakespeare, and in fact the chapters in my book quite conventionally are done pretty much in the order we think Shakespeare wrote them. And I chose it because I think it's a really good example of this central theme that we've just been talking about. One of the things I wanted to do for each of the chapters in my book was to give a sort of synopsis of the play. I absolutely know that for lots of people, the details of these plays are not on the tip of your tongue. And I wanted to sort of give a sort of short scenario. What's this play about? And with the Taming of the Shrew, that's actually impossible, because you can't give a kind of neutral account of the play and then say, well, or it could be another way around. Everything you say about the play is open to an alternative view. So, for example, you could say this is a play in which a sort of zany sort of social pair of social outcasts get together, and they are shocking to the sort of bourgeois couples and families around them, but they've found each other and they're going to have a very unconventional but actually very mutual kind of relationship. Or you could say, here is a feisty woman who knows her own mind, and that mind is not to get married. And her father marries her off without her agreement to a man who is just a bounty hunter. He wants her money, and he treats her abominably and breaks her spirit until at the end she is brought out to mouth some sort of patriarchal kind of platitudes. Now, they're completely different plays, but they're both Taming of the Shrew, and there are lots of other aspects of the play which are different in different sort of interpretations and depending how you look on it. So it seemed to me actually a great place to start, because the gappiness and the ambiguity is absolutely hardwired into that play. It's really, really fundamental. The title suggests that the shrew, presumably the character Catherine, has been tamed, but my title would have a question mark at the end of it. Has she? Is she the shrew?
Absolutely. And you mentioned it is one of the early comedies, and Shakespeare's comedies tend to be very back and forth, very almost sitcom. They rapid fire right along. And yet, in the end, Kate has this long speech that kind of comes out of nowhere, which is ironic because at first it seems misplaced. To your point, is she tame? And then she opens up on this very, very long speech, and it is a bit antithetical to Petruchio's last few lines as well.
Yeah, I mean, Kate. So we haven't seen Catherine for ages in the play. That's quite often the case in Act 4 in Shakespeare. I don't think he's very good at it. Don't think he knows what to do usually. And if you're a theatre maker, you're probably going to make some of your cuts there because not much seems to be happening. And that's kind of true here too, that the play switches away from the main characters and has a bit of side plot that doesn't seem in a way very important. And then back comes Catherine, and she speaks a speech which is about 50 lines long, telling the other women in the play and in the audience, in fact, that how they should obey their husbands. And it's a really striking speech, because on the face of it, she's just saying, women owe loyalty to their husbands. They owe loyalty just as the citizen owes loyalty to the monarch and the servant to the master. And this is all in a chain of proper relationships. Your husband looks after you, so you should look after him. So she goes on and on and on and on. In some ways, it goes on for so long that it starts to self-destruct, I think. There's only so long as a woman in a sort of patriarchal world where you can stand talking uninterrupted, saying women are just worms, women should their husbands should do everything, they should just be quiet and let their husbands speak. The fact that she's just standing there going on and on and on starts to ironize the whole situation. So I think it's a really kind of wonderful case. It's a brilliant example of how actors actually can turn that in some quite different ways, and how the body language of Catherine can change very much. I remember seeing an actor do that speech in different ways, and one of the ways she did it like this, and you just think, just having the arms folded was just go on, yeah, just you dare, yeah, I mean, it's a posture which is full of a kind of contrary to the words that are said, and that's obviously a really kind of amazingly wonderful thing about the theatre, that it operates in all these different dimensions, and that what the bodies of the actors can be doing on stage and their words are saying can be completely at odds, and that's one of the ways in which sort of wonderful meanings and discoveries happen. And Marcus is quite right. At the end of this long speech, Catherine says, well, women should be ready to put their hands under their husband's foot, and that's what I'm ready to do now. There's no stage direction, so we don't know whether she does put her hand under Petruchio's foot. And Petruchio says in the line, which is, for anybody who likes a musical, has become the most sort of celebrated line in this play, "Why, there's a wench, come on and kiss me, Kate." Again, though, one of the ways in which these gaps happen in Shakespeare is there is no stage direction.
Right.
So if you want to say, yes, they kiss, or she kisses him, or he kisses her, all of which are quite different, aren't they? You could, but you could also maintain an ending to the play where he asks for something and is actually rebuffed, or that doesn't quite happen, or there's a standoff, or the play ends on an off note. One of the other characters then speaks the very last lines of the play, and sometimes I've seen that done where they're covering over the fact that Catherine and Petruchio are, as we would say in the UK, snogging enthusiastically. And they're sort of saying, but maybe it's time for us to finish now. But I've also seen it done where those final lines are stepping into a very awkward pause, and trying to say something because this is not how it's ended up, and you know, those possibilities are all there, waiting in the script for, you know, for actors and for people like Marcus to explore in the rehearsal room, to bring out
Well, it's funny. The first time I saw this production, you know, I had no real strong point of view of it other than having read the play. And the production I saw, I was a student in graduate school at the time, and I saw this wonderful production. It was an all-male production, actually. And the actor playing Kate, the reason that how the actor justified the length of that speech was that she kept talking over him. So she would give him just enough breath that he would go to say something, and then she would start talking again and talking again until finally he was beaten into submission verbally. And he went to say, finally, you know, kiss me. He never got the words out. She grabbed him and literally threw him up against the wall and just planted this smothering kiss on him. So it became this kind of illusion of, you know, masculine power and possessiveness. And so they flipped it around really easy. And I think that lends to your point of gappiness, you know, especially when we look at it through this sense of kind of gender and power. And it's interesting. What you know, that leads to my next one. I want to talk a little about Twelfth Night, because those Taming of the Shrew and Twelfth Night in this book were really interesting to me. Twelfth Night, you chose Twelfth Night to focus on the character of Antonio and his relationship specifically with Sebastian, which I found very interesting because I hadn't given it that much thought before. And then the minute you unpacked it for me, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to see it differently again. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So why I wanted to talk about this minor character in Twelfth Night. So Antonio is a kind of sailor or some kind of figure who rescues the twin of the central character Viola. He's called Sebastian, and kind of hangs around with him a bit. But he seems quite a pointless character. And I'm always quite interested in things which seem sort of unnecessary. And I'm particularly interested in it because one of the things we know about Shakespeare is that he writes for the theatre company in which he's a shareholder. So he's got literally a real investment in his company. He also, unlike all the other playwrights of the time, he's got an absolutely fixed market, if you like, for his own plays. He doesn't have to go around auditioning or sort of pitching to different companies as, you know, Ben Jonson or Christopher Marlowe or somebody would do. He knows who's going to perform in his plays, and he knows you know, how they're going to be performed and the theatre they're going to be performed in, and he's writing them all very much with a cast and a sort of scenario in mind. And one of the ways in which he writes them with that in mind is with great economy for the number of actors that are needed. So we think that most Shakespeare plays have about 30 named characters. They can usually be acted by 12 adult actors, and sometimes two, sometimes three younger, sort of late adolescent actors who play women's roles. So they're very tightly organized, and often actors will play more than one role, but that's very cleverly written so that there's time for them to change their costume, which is no small time actually, when there are no you know, Velcro or zips or any of those easy fastenings. You know, fastening you into a costume would be like sort of lacing you into a kind of bodice or something. It's a really kind of quite takes quite a long time. So they're carefully done, that's to say, to maximize the use of a relatively small number of actors. So that means that if you've got a character who doesn't seem to be really worth it in terms of the plot, there's a kind of oddity there. And particularly when one of the things I love about comedies and how they work for Shakespeare is that they have a big busy scene at the end when everybody comes on stage, and that's the way that all the sort of misunderstandings get ironed out and we see people again. But it's also an affirmation that comedies have the sense that the world is big and that we are at our best when we are together. We get on each other's nerves and we sometimes misunderstand each other, but really we are sociable and social animals, and that's what comedy understands. I mean, tragedy, I think, thinks we are isolated monsters, and that's how we're headed. So at the end of Twelfth Night, this character Antonio is there. So that means he can't be any of the other characters. The actor can't play any of the other characters who might also be there. So all these things are adding up to a sense. This is quite an expensive use of an actor. So that made me look a bit more closely at why he might be there. And to sort of, I've spent a long time on the structure of the theatre, and the payoff in the play might seem a bit small for that. But I think that what is important about Antonio is he represents a kind of selfless desire. He's in love with Sebastian, whatever you think that means, whatever you want that to mean. You could argue that this is the strong kinds of male friendship that were entirely understood in the Renaissance and entirely compatible with men being married to women. Or you could say that they are gay in a kind of proto-modern way. But what's more important than that is that Antonio is absolutely selfless. He is willing to put himself in danger for the thing that he loves. And that is something that really almost nobody else in the play, for all their music be the food of love and all of that, they're all pretty self-obsessed. They're a kind of, it's a narcissistic world, I think, Twelfth Night, and very beautiful for that. I mean, narcissists are very often very, very beautiful and very sort of compelling. But Antonio brings something different, and that felt an important kind of sideways into the play. I think one of the ways I deal myself with the fact that these plays have got all this huge weight of clever and scholarly critical opinion. You know, it's really hard to think how would you do something different with these plays than has been done by much cleverer and much more erudite people than me in the past. And one of the ways I think is sort of creeping up on them a bit from the side, or, you know, sort of trying to catch the play unawares and sort of tip it onto its back, as if it's a kind of porcupine or something. And I think doing the Antonio, that's a bit of a kind of sideways kind of creep up, so the play doesn't quite know that you're there, and then you can sort of startle it to reveal something that it might not have been there.
So let's talk about that for a minute. You know, let's talk about Elizabethan's view of love, especially male love. You know, it's different than it is today. Today, to your point, we use a lot of labels. We have, you know, a lot of ways to kind of dictate that. But in an Elizabethan purview, I mean, the idea of male love would have been very different. I mean, you were kind of in a position where you had to marry a woman, but they weren't necessarily going to be your soulmate.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, and that's so. This is a culture which places a very high value on male friendships, and suggests that really it is only with other men or another man who is your sort of soulmate that you can be yourself, and that your wife may be, you know, pleasant enough and domestic enough, and you would have your children and continue your line, but your wife was very unlikely to have had the same education as you, was very unlikely to have had the same experience of the world as you. You were perhaps it was more limited, the number of things that you could talk about. You know, the number of you know, scholarly and educated men in this period we know who were married to women who don't seem to have been able to write, suggests a kind of a disparity between the experience, which, you know, we all know couples who are absolutely devoted despite all, you know, those kinds of differences. But I think generally, culturally, it was understood that in particular men would have their strongest emotional relationships with other men.
So in this case too, would you agree that the theater becomes a teacher in part of the education of the Elizabethan youth?
Yeah, I think it does. It's interesting, these rom-coms that we still have the genre. We now associate it almost entirely with women, young women, and how they should behave. But really, this was a genre which was developed to teach young men how to behave. And in Shakespeare's hands, it's usually about the fact that in order to get married, the message is men have to give up their primary attachment to other men. And that's one of the things I do in the book is I try and think about modern examples, and some of these work for some people and don't for other people, and some have been very annoying to some readers. But on this point, I talk about the sitcom Friends, and I talk about the very last episode of that long-running series, which is about the guys moving out of their apartment and breaking up the table football, which has been the sort of sign of their sort of bachelor life. Mm. And, you know, they're all moving on, and that's a good thing, and they need to do that. But it's also really sad. And I think that's very, very Shakespearean. It's a very Shakespearean comedy kind of moment that men find themselves losing something, particularly men. The focus is on men. Although in some cases women too, but largely men find themselves really losing something when they get hooked up with women. So do you think the plays seem to be, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say the plays seem to say, yeah, suck it up. That's what you need to do. Yeah.
So I guess that answers my question in some ways. Is Shakespeare? Do you believe Shakespeare in this point is being subversive, or has this become an anthem for the youth of that time? Is he saying, you know, this is totally normal, you should, you know, this is what it is? Or is he saying, no, because it is a comedy like any other, and the comedies drive toward marriage. So is he, you know, or is he being subversive under all that, saying, look, what you're feeling is normal, this is normal, this is, you know, or it's this happens? Like,
it's a really great question. I think people went to the theatre in Shakespeare's time to be taken away from their everyday world. These are not primarily realistic, or they're certainly not documentary plays. They're not realistic plays. They're not, as we would say about sort of 20th century British drama, they're not kitchen sink dramas. They are much more fairy tale-y and much more escapist, and much more things can happen in the theatre. You know, what happens in the theatre stays in the theatre. You know, things can happen in the theatre that can't happen in real life. And I guess Twelfth Night is really interesting on that. So if we're saying about men, these strong relationships between men have to be broken in order for men to get married, Twelfth Night really turns that, not just with Antonio, but in fact with the central, one of the central couples, Orsino and Viola. So Orsino has fallen in love with a young man who is actually Viola in male costume. And he has developed this male-male friendship, which is all about confiding in him and going out riding and doing sort of manly things together. But and at the end, you know, it's really Orsino realizes that Cesario is really a woman, and it's an absolute bingo. He's got both. He does not have to choose between his best male friend and his wife, because this ambiguous sort of male-female figure in Twelfth Night can be both.
When I was in graduate school, I played Orsino. I got cast in that role, and that's exactly how I played it. And the big reveal came. I almost went and kissed him, and I stopped, or you know, I or you know, and I stopped because he turns real quick. He turns and he's like, "Oh, but I've always loved you," you know. But that was exactly it. You know, you get your both, and so Orsino, it just fits. He's the epitome of narcissism in that way, right? That's great. So you know, when we talk about theater as education too, and Elizabethan education, the young Elizabethans, you know, they went to school and they primarily they learned rhetoric, didn't they? I mean, that was kind of really what they were taught. Yes. And so with Shakespeare, you know, he would have learned this, and yet he goes back to what is in essence at the time a didactic theater, and he starts creating this new form, so to speak, this form of question, not answering. And
yes, I think what Shakespeare, like other Elizabethan schoolboys, learnt was an education, as you say, which was really focused on rhetoric and oratory, and on sort of rewriting stories, existing stories, classical stories, from one form into another, or from one perspective into another. So there's a really common classroom exercise that Shakespeare and his contemporaries would have done, which was about, writing a speech by someone who isn't given a speech, sort of at the fall of Troy, or at this point in a kind of classical story. And I think it produced two particular professions in profusion. One was the theatre, the other was lawyers, I think. It's quite a kind of lawyerly a training as well, but it leads very directly, I think, into the theatre, and I think it leads into this kind of gappy quality that I've talked about. One important thing about classroom rhetoric was it was not at all important what you believed to be true. So it wasn't saying, persuade me that your view is right. It was saying, make the case for both sides and make it as compelling as you can. So, make this person's view of this story as real and as compelling as their enemy's view of it. That's the job of that's what rhetoric is supposed to do. And I think that's what the plays do. And that means it's actually very difficult sometimes to judge where Shakespeare wants our sympathies to lie. In a play like Julius Caesar, where Caesar is assassinated, it's really hard to know. You could look at it that Caesar was a threat to the Republic, and that Brutus and Cassius are honorable men, as we hear later, or you could see that Caesar is a decent leader who is just murdered.
So one of the things you talk about, and bring up Julius Caesar, is this sense of like power and the theater of politics. You talk about power, and when you mentioned Richard II as well, and it's interesting because this idea of good leadership, bad leadership, of creating a balanced argument, a balanced character, so to speak. So Richard II is grossly unbalanced, and we can see that kind of moving right into it. And but he's a better actor than Bolingbroke. Can you talk about that a little bit, about the balance of the power between those two?
Yeah. So I think Richard II does absolutely dramatize the discrepancy between theatrical power and political power. So Richard is absolutely dominant in his play. We could put it another way. Richard II thinks he is in a tragedy, and he's in a tragedy which is named after him, and so he is the main character, and he has to have a lot of big poetic speeches, because that's what it is to be in a tragedy. Henry Bolingbroke thinks he is in a history. There isn't a lot of time for talking in history. You've got to strap your armor on and hack your way through the battlefield and get power that way. Now, that makes Bolingbroke not a very compelling character on the stage. He doesn't tell us anything about himself. He doesn't confide in us. We don't really know why he does what he does, but it makes him a very ruthlessly effective kind of political figure. Richard is the complete opposite. He is all, he's absolutely sort of melting all over the stage. We see we're with him. He has an extraordinary emotional and poetic range. He's absolutely center stage. And while he's doing that, somebody is marching into the throne room and taking the crown.
Well, it's interesting.
Something similar is happening, in fact, in Hamlet, when they're all talk. Fortinbras is just marching, stamp. Yeah, and then they're all dead, and in he comes and says, "Oh,
I'll take it.
Like you need me."
Right, that's right. And I love this idea of balance. And I've been chewing on it since I read those chapters, that Richard II is being this kind of unbalanced character, but he's a better actor. And then Bolingbroke comes in, and he is not very good politically, theatrically. And he is what he is as a leader. To your point, there's a purity of purpose about who he is as a character, but we don't get a sense of balance. And so the play leaves us very dry, very cold. We know that the bad leader is gone, the new leader is in. That was correct. However, we're all kind of left a little, what happens now? And you do go into Henry IV Part 1 a bit in the book. And it was interesting because Falstaff, the introduction of Falstaff, I think is just seems so much bigger to me in so many ways now that you've introduced this idea of balance. Because and although I know you didn't touch on Henry IV Part 2 and Henry V, but Falstaff seems to be the outlier to me in that argument, where we see Henry V kind of getting tutored in the theatrics by Falstaff, this character that is introduced early on. And in essence, it makes him a more balanced king when he finally ascends to the throne. So in some ways, do you feel like all of those are about, to your point, balance, and the balance and theatrics of power and kind of the marriage of those things? And again, is Shakespeare, is that Shakespeare being subversive during that time, or is it a warning?
I think you're right that there is. I mean, one argument is that that Henry V is Shakespeare's kind of hero king who is able to combine the rhetorical effectiveness of Richard II and the political pragmatism of Henry Bolingbroke, and so he is kind of unbeatable, and that's why he's able to have this famous victory over the French. Yeah, and I think that's a great idea. That it's Falstaff who brings those two things together. I think it's an interesting question whether Shakespeare's histories are subversive or conventional. We used to always be taught that they were conventional and that they were in the service of the Tudor monarchy. But certainly they're written at a time when any discussion of even these ideas that we've been talking about, what makes the good leader? I mean, that's if you have an inherited monarchy, the question of what makes a good leader is itself a very, very subversive question, because you're not getting a good leader, you're just getting the son of the leader you had before. And if they happen to be good, great, but it's not really for debate. This is not these are not elections.
How far along the line do we need to get before we forget the Rex and Tyrannus, right? It's like, well, this was by God, and now this person took it. Well, yeah, but they're the king now, so that's kind of the way it is. And to your point, that's who we have now. So
yes, yeah, I mean, we still have that in the UK, saying, will Charles make a good king? You think, well, actually, if that were the criterion, we'd do it all quite differently, wouldn't we? I mean, Charles will be king. That's it.
It's interesting. So, and to this point, Shakespeare followed up Henry V, where I do feel like he finds this balance with this character to some degree, and he follows it up with Julius Caesar, which is amazing, because suddenly he's kind of turning it all over again. And your chapter on Caesar in the book, again, I want to get back to the book a little bit. You focus on a very small character, Cinna the poet. Can you explain why?
Well, again, I was sort of thinking about sort of creeping up on the play, and I was thinking about why, what happens when a poet or a writer writes a little cameo about a writer. What does that mean? That seems to be sort of weighted in ways that it wouldn't be if they wrote a little cameo about a kind of a butcher or a shoemaker or something. So what happens in Julius Caesar is after the assassination of Caesar, and the crowd have been turned by Mark Antony's brilliant rhetoric, the speech which begins, friends, Romans, and countrymen, they've been turned to think that actually what Brutus and the others have done has been a terrible act of violence. And a crowd leaving turn on this innocent bystander who happens to share the name of one of the conspirators, who's called Cinna. And this is somebody who's called Cinna the poet, and he keeps saying, "I'm not that Cinna." And they say, "Well, we're just going to get you anyway." And they taunt him, and it's not completely clear, but I think in most readings of the play would say they pretty much tear him to pieces. They beat him to death. This is a kind of act of mob violence, and it's hard to read in the context of the play. It's hard to know whether we're supposed to think this is a sign that everything, law and order has completely gone now. The death of Caesar has unleashed this terrible decline in sort of behavior in society, or whether it's a kind of echo of the death of Caesar, but instead of being of a really important person that we've all heard of, and it's of this very minor person who we've never heard of, and who is a sort of, in a way, kind of a joke figure, but a joke figure that has something terrible happen to them. So I tried to use that to think again about the sort of sympathies in the play, and also about something which I think is very modern about Julius Caesar, which is the consciousness that lots of the characters have that, well, there's a kind of weird way in which they already know they're in a famous story. So they know they're in it in real time, and that in the future people will talk about it, but they also know they also are already in that future when people know about it. So they're a bit like, I feel as if I were putting it on now, they would take selfies with Caesar's body. That's what we would see.
Yeah.
It's already in the eye of history. It's already there. It's already being recorded. And that's something I feel very fascinated by about that play.
And Shakespeare doesn't let him off easy either. Once he is murdered, he introduces another character called, it's just like another poet, I think, right?
Yeah, there's another poet then. I mean, there's something gone very, very, very wrong somehow at the end of the play, that things multiply in some odd ways. I enjoy it when sometimes there's like feeling Shakespeare's play worlds sort of run away from him a bit. I think when Hamlet goes off to England and meets the pirates and stuff, you just think, oh no,
we've lost the plot.
We've really lost it here, haven't we? If you were in playwriting 101, you'd say, I don't think really at this point in the play we need pirates as well. Do you really? We've had, and I think something like that happens a little bit. The play doesn't, just as there's a gap in the world when Caesar is dead, nobody knows what to do. There's a slight feeling the play doesn't quite know where to go either. It's experimented by having its main tragic death in the middle, and that's very powerful and very interesting, but then it means it's a little bit difficult to know what you do after that. How do you make a shape out of that?
It's interesting. In some ways, I've always felt that portion of it, the play, the momentum of the play, psychology of the play, takes on the momentum of the mob. It takes on its own mob momentum, where it's focused at first, and it kind of achieves what it needs to achieve, and then it just starts running rampant and getting bigger, and then there's all these casualties kind of falling around it.
Yeah.
And I was always hopeful that maybe that was purposeful in some of it.
Yeah, I think it may or may not be purposeful, but it's certainly meaningful. I think that's the distinction I would make. I don't mind whether it's purposeful. It just matters whether it's meaningful.
So and with mobs, like one of the other plays you talk about is Coriolanus. Coriolanus is one of, I believe it to be one of the most difficult plays that Shakespeare wrote. I had the privilege of playing the title character years ago, and I had already done my Hamlet, so I thought I was ready for Coriolanus, and I found it to be infinitely, in some ways, more challenging. I never believed that Shakespeare necessarily wrote psychology, but his writing is deeply psychological. And I found it really in Coriolanus. And you have a play. A lot of my students in class will say, "Oh, Coriolanus, I never read it, never heard about it." They read it, they don't get it. They talk about the irrelevance of Shakespeare, and I say, "Okay, let's look at it again." The play begins with civil unrest. We've got, I mean, it begins at the end of a war. We have Coriolanus who instantly says, "Oh, he's please forgive this man who helped me. He was a poor man," all these things. And then he instantly can't remember his name. And so this poor man is going to be trucked off and killed. And then there is a mob in the streets who is rioting for food. It smacks to our own day and age in so many ways. And it also talks to the theater of politics in a lot of ways. Coriolanus is an utter failure in some ways theatrically. So, when we talk about class divide in politics, and at this point in Shakespeare's writing, do you think he's writing, would you say he was writing for, again, kind of a social agenda, or is he writing, because his writing also changes specifically in that play, that his verse starts to change in a whole different sort of way. Is he writing for actors whom have grown with him and who have turned over in some degree within his company?
I think he probably is writing for actors. I think he's writing for the mature Richard Burbage, who, like you, has done Hamlet and is sort of moving towards, not that you are necessarily, but is moving towards Prospero. So Coriolanus is sort of in there. I think there is an interesting aspect about Coriolanus in its own moment, where I think so Shakespeare's company spend most of Shakespeare's career they spend performing in so-called outdoor playhouses, like Shakespeare's Globe on London's Bankside, which the rebuilt Globe, if you ever have visited London or seen it online. And then around 1608, which is about the date of Coriolanus, they get the lease on an indoor theatre called Blackfriars. And Blackfriars is effectively it's a boutique theatre. It's much smaller and much more expensive and much higher status to go to than the Globe. And it does seem interesting to me that he writes a play which is all about a man saying, "I'm not going to show myself off before the masses. I'm not going to give them exactly what they want. I'm not going to act and show my wounds. I'm not going to do what you want me to do. I'm not, I'm sort of better than that." And that there is a sort of theatrical element to that. I mean, in some ways, what Coriolanus doesn't want to be is in the Globe.
Right.
And I think one of the reasons he's such a difficult character is he doesn't want to be an actor. He doesn't want to do the things that we're back to what we were talking about the English history plays that are the same for actors and for politicians, which is about being visible to an audience, and that's exactly the thing he won't do, and that's pretty rebarbative in a theatrical character, because that's what we want them to do.
That's great. I know we're running a little short on time. I had one more play that I was so hoping was going to be in the book, and I would love to just pick your brain on it a little bit, because you picked 20 plays to kind of touch on. I'd like to know why you picked those plays, and the one play I would love to just hear you talk about a little bit is Titus Andronicus, which I feel such a play, a timely play, and a play really that centers about otherness in so many different ways. And I'd love to just hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, in fact, funnily enough, there was a big Shakespeare course in Arizona, which was adopting, in the University of Arizona, was adopting my book. And they wrote to me and said, "Will you write a Titus Andronicus chapter?" And I said, "Yeah, fine, no, absolutely. I'd love to do that." Yeah, I think it's an extraordinary, cruel play about our terribly disturbing capacity for violence and for bystanding. So I think it's a great challenge to ideas of tragedy. I think it makes us look at Shakespeare's tragedies a bit differently as well. because it does bring out the kind of really unhealthy aspect there is to tragedies which focus on the terrible sort of trauma of the suffering, you know, those who suffer in tragedy. You know, what kind of entertainment is that? You know, what kind of people are we? And I think it sort of holds a mirror up, not to nature, as Hamlet would say, or perhaps to nature exactly, but it's a rather unflattering one. So yeah, I think that is probably the play I most regret leaving out. And I'm so relieved that you didn't say As You Like It, because then I always have to say, I really don't like it. So, not very much, thank you. And then I think that offends people who love it.
Oh, that's great. Well, listen, I know we're short on time. I would love to end again with a little quote from your epilogue, which I also love very much. So if I may. The epilogue is a place in Shakespeare's plays where the vitally constitutive role of the audience is explicitly acknowledged. Without them, without us, the play is incomplete. So, this is Shakespeare. Permissive, modern, challenging, gappy, frustrating, moving, attenuated, beautiful, ambiguous, resourceful, provoking, necessary. Yours. Emma Smith, this was a beautiful novel. Thank you so much for this. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Marcus. I've loved talking to you about it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
We have a few great audience questions. We are low on time, but I'd love to get to at least a couple of them. The first one is from Brenny, saying, the playwright David Henry Hwang, writing after 9/11, said, the function of art is to make ambiguity tolerable. What advice do you give to teachers, say, to keep the gaps enticing and not irritating or confusing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it's a tough ask when you're working in a context where you're just trying to get one meaning across, never mind 2 or 3. And I recognize that that's a really tough ask. I think sometimes this is where, you know, performance is a kind of fantastic resource. YouTube performances, which very often will can give you some quite different takes on a speech or on a scene that can sort of bring that a bit more to life for students. I think trying to get a bit of an argument going, perhaps sometimes in the class, about why people behave as they do. I found that sometimes works with older students. But yeah, and it's a wonderful quotation. Thanks, Brenny. Thanks for bringing that forward.
There's, I think we only have time for maybe one more question, and there's a great one here from Emma. She says, we're so used to modern characters making active choices and having agency, like Fortinbras. And yet one of Hamlet's signature characteristics is indecision, but he's still compelling. Does that speak to those gaps? I'd love to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, Emma, that's a really that's a great observation, that modern characters do things, and that makes Hamlet's apparent refusal to do anything a kind of challenge. I think understanding Hamlet's, in some ways, Hamlet is the character where ambiguity and sort of an openness to different interpretations has long been clearly understood. It's a great place for where performance can imagine the world of Hamlet in some quite different ways and quite distinctive ways. So I think the gaps are there. The questions about why Hamlet behaves as he does, or fails to do, fails to act as you suggest. In the book, I talk about why it is. This is perhaps another sideways thing, but it does speak to a point about agency. I talk to the question of why he has the same name as his father. Now, for you in America, that doesn't seem so strange. I get that. For us in the UK, it really does seem very strange that you don't tend to name a person directly. We don't have the sort of Hamlet Jr. But I was thinking about Hamlet Jr. and what it's like to be a Hamlet Jr. which is to say it is about being overshadowed and perhaps haunted by the person who's just Hamlet, which is his father, and that was one of the ways I tried to think about the sort of psychology there. So it's a great question. Thank you.
So unfortunately, we are out of time for this evening. I could have listened to the two of you talk all night long, but Emma, I know it's very late for you in the UK. Audience, thank you so much for being here. Emma Smith and Marcus Dean Fuller, thank you so much for your time and this delightful conversation. I have enjoyed this tremendously, and from watching the comments in the chat, I gather that our audience really has as well. You can order This is Shakespeare at northshire.com. The link has been in the chat, and thank you all so much. Have a lovely, lovely rest of your evening.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.